Hello, everyone. This week, we're going to concentrate on the kingdom Protista. Protista kingdom contains organisms that are the precursors of all the plants, fungi, and animals in the world. They came from that kingdom. Precursors of the plants are protists called algae. And this week, we're going to concentrate on them. Algae exhibit something called an alternation of generations. And that's going to be our topic for this lab, to try and understand what that actually means. The generations here include a haploid generation, which has only one set of genes in every cell, and alternates with a diploid generation that has two sets of genes. So we're going to take a look at that throughout this PowerPoint and see if we can understand how that works in the algae. Once we understand it in the algae, then we can apply that in a future lab to the actual plant kingdom, which actually does the same thing. In order to understand it, though, we need to master some vocabulary. Haploid, sometimes called monoploid, means a cell that has only one set of genes or one set of chromosomes. It only has one gene for each protein it makes. A diploid cell is a cell or an organism that has two complete sets of chromosomes, usually caused by the fusion of an egg, which has one set, and a sperm, which also has one set. So one set plus one set gives you the two sets when they fuse together. Mitosis is the replication of a cell's nucleus. But in mitosis, it's an actual replication of whatever kind of nucleus you started with. If it's a haploid nucleus, you will create two haploid nuclei identical to each other. If it's a diploid nucleus, it will create two diploid nuclei. Meiosis is a different story. Meiosis is the reduction of a nucleus from a diploid condition, which has two sets of genes, to a haploid condition. That's very important in order to create sex cells. Speaking of sex cells, we're talking about gametes. A gamete is an egg or a sperm, and they are almost always haploid. A gametophyte, now phyte is an ending of a word here that means plant. So a gametophyte is a plant that makes gametes, or in this case for the Protista, a plant-like organism, algae, that makes gametes. Now, gametophytes are haploid organisms. That means all their cells only have one set of genes, and they produce haploid gametes, eggs and sperm, by mitosis, because it's haploid to haploid. Spores, on the other hand, are not gametes. They are cells that can grow into something all by themselves. They don't have to fuse together like gametes do. A sporophyte is a plant-like organism that is diploid, always diploid, and it produces those spores. And it produces the spores in a haploid condition. One set of genes in the spores coming from a two set of genes organism. In order to go from 2N to 1N like that, you need to do it by meiosis. Remember, meiosis is the way that organisms change diploid cells into haploid cells. A zygote is a diploid fertilized egg. It is what results when an egg and a sperm fuse together. And because an haploid egg and a haploid sperm, one set of genes each, fuse together, you end up with a diploid zygote. Let's take a look at this diagram, which illustrates how plant-like protists like algae and plants themselves actually do this alternation of generations. Let's start with the gametophyte. Gametophyte is a plant-like creature that makes gametes by mitosis. They are haploid, and those haploid gametes are the eggs in the sperm. And if you follow the arrow, you'll see it says mitosis coming from the gametophyte. And those are the gametes, the eggs in the sperm, those white little circles. They will eventually fuse together. They may come from different gametophytes or sometimes even the same one. They will fuse together to create the diploid stage. The diploid stage, the first cell of that is the zygote, or the fertilized egg. That zygote will replicate and grow into the sporophyte stage. Now, the sporophyte stage is a diploid plant-like creature or plant that makes spores, but the spores are haploid, as you can see. They go back up to the haploid area. And so if you're going from a diploid sporophyte to make haploid spores, you need to do that by meiosis, diploid to haploid. The spores, remember, can grow into something all by themselves. So each one of those spores can grow into another gametophyte. And so you can see the gametophyte makes gametes. The gametes fuse together to form a zygote that makes a sporophyte. The sporophyte makes haploid spores that go back into the gametophyte. And there's the alternation. The gametophyte makes the sporophyte, and the sporophyte makes the gametophyte, and it keeps going round and round. Now we're going to, our example for this, for the algae today, is going to be, one of them is going to be kelp. Kelp is the giant seaweed that grows in the ocean, usually under the water. And some of them actually form huge forests under the water of kelp. And some people actually eat this as part of their diet, especially in Japan. So if you look at this life cycle here, I superimposed up on the top there that simple alternation of generations diagram that we just went through. But we're now going to apply that to the diagram below, which is the alternation of generations of the kelp. So we'll start out with something that looks just like a kelp. That's that big sort of brownish yellow organism that says sporophyte. Looks like a big leaf, and sometimes can be literally meters long. The sporophyte is diploid. Sporophytes are diploid organisms that make haploid spores by meiosis. So we expect someplace on that sporophyte that there's going to be meiosis happening to create haploid spores. Sporophytes make spores. And so if you follow underneath there, you see it says meiosis. It happens in those little leafy structures in the kelp called the sporophylls. And the meiosis creates cells that are haploid. And of course, since it's a sporophyte doing that, they're spores. Now, we call them zoospores, or some people say zoospores, because ZOO is a word that means modal, or you can move. And so these zoospores are haploid because they're created by meiosis from a diploid sporophyte, and they can swim. They have little undulapodia and flagella or cilia, whatever you want to call them, and they can wiggle, and they can cause the zoospores to swim. Each one of those spores can grow into the gametophyte stage. Now, some of the spores are going to grow into a male gametophyte. Other spores are set up to grow into female gametophytes. Now, the gametophytes are very, very small. They don't look at all like the sporophyte. If you pick up a shell on a sort of a golden brown marker or marking pen, and you drew a little line on the shell with some branches coming off the line, that would what the male and female gametophytes would actually look like. They actually grow on rocks or on shells as tiny little organisms, only a few cells each, and they are nothing at all like the sporophyte. We call that process, when the gametophytes and the sporophytes do not look alike, we call that heteromorphic. And so what happens is the male gametophyte obviously is haploid, because gametophytes are always haploid and they make eggs and sperm by mitosis. The gametophyte is going to be making the sperm, the male gametophyte, and the female gametophyte is going to be making the eggs. Eventually, the sperm will swim to the eggs, and there'll be a fertilization. That's sex. The egg and the fertilized egg is, of course, a zygote, and you see that there on the diagram. Zygote's now diploid because it's a fusion of an egg and a sperm. That diploid zygote will develop back into the kelp. And so the beauty of this is you can make a lot of spores. Each one of those spores can grow into gametophytes, and each one can make lots of eggs and lots of sperm. And so just one time around the cycle here, you can make a lot of kelp. So that is the alternation of generations in brown algae or kelp. Now, the next one we're going to look at here, there's a diagram of a kelp forest. You can see how big they actually get. The next one we're going to talk about today is one that has what they call an isomorphic alternation of generations. Isomorphic means that the gametophyte and the sporophyte look identical. You can't tell them apart unless you have a microscope. The example we're going to talk about here is something called sea lettuce, the common algae that you see all over the beach. It looks like a green, sheet of paper all wrinkled up on the sand or in the water. Its Latin name is ulva or ulva lactuca. Now, if you look at this diagram, we're going to take a look at how that works. You pick up a piece of ulva from the beach. It's a green sheet, a little wrinkly on the edges. And let's say you picked up one that happened to be diploid. Now, you wouldn't be able to tell that unless you had a microscope and some fancy equipment in the lab, because you can't tell by looking at it. But let's say those cells are all diploid, and that would be the sporophyte generation you just picked up, because sporophyte is the diploid stage that makes haploid spores by meiosis. And around the edges of the ova, cells will do meiosis, and those zoospores will swim out. They all have 4 undulapodia or flagella, and they all swim around, and one piece of ova can make many, many, many spores. Now, each one of those spores can grow into a gametophyte. Now, the gametophyte is the haploid generation because it grew from that haploid zoospore, which came from meiosis from the diploid sporophyte. The gametophyte stage is haploid, but in this case, it looks identical to the sporophyte. So we say this is an isomorphic situation where the gametophyte and the sporophyte are identical. But the sporophyte is diploid. The gametophyte is haploid. So what does gametophytes do? Gametophytes are haploid organisms that make haploid gametes by mitosis. So they're going to make those little gametes. Some of them are going to be eggs and some of them are going to be sperm. In ova, you really can't tell the difference too much between an egg and a sperm. So we'll just call them plus and minus cells. The plus ones would be the sperm, the minus ones would be the eggs. They will fuse together to create the zygote. Zygote being the diploid first cell of the new organism, the fertilized egg. The zygote will then develop into sporophyte, and it'll go round and round again throughout the whole season when the ova can grow in the ocean. The beauty of this is that it's very powerful life cycle, because the sporophyte can make one piece of ova can make literally hundreds or even thousands of spores, and each one of those can grow into a gametophyte, each one. And each gametophyte can make many, many, many gametes, and they can fuse together to make lots of zygotes. And so one time around, if everything lives, which it never does, you can make one sporophyte can produce, probably a couple of thousand sporophytes in one turn around the cycle. So it's a very powerful life cycle to allow organisms like this to live in the ocean and survive. There's a piece of ova, and what it looks like on the beach sometimes. And you really can't tell, is it a sporophyte or a gametophyte, because it's isomorphic and they look alike. Well, I hope that helped you understand a alternation of generations. I'm going to give you a little quiz on this, and just take the quiz on before next Sunday and we'll be good to go.